is what Jesus does. Healing people who are suffering is a dominant characteristic of Jesus's ministry. Just, but what each story reveals is that Jesus heals because Jesus feels. Jesus heals because Jesus is affected by the sorrow and misery, the pain and afflictions of the people that Jesus encounters. The Gospels tell us that Jesus is not some dazzling wonder worker who heals but remains untouched by those who suffer. Jesus is not a Messiah who floats safely above the sorrows and tears of life. Rather, Jesus is a Messiah who makes himself vulnerable to the bruised and broken, who makes himself vulnerable to the crushed and abandoned of the world. Jesus is not a bronze Messiah who heals but feels nothing. Rather, Jesus is a Messiah who heals only by first drawing near and entering into relationship with people who suffer. If you look at those gospel stories closely, you'll notice that something happens to Jesus when Jesus encounters someone who is suffering. The pains and the sorrows of human beings enter into Jesus's heart. They touch him and draw him out in response. Now, that I think is the meaning of compassion. With compassion, we don't stand at a safe distance from people who are struggling. We don't put a wall between ourselves and other human sufferers, but rather, with compassion, like Jesus, we become people who are characteristically responsive to the sufferings and struggles of others. People who are characteristically inclined to answer the call to come out of ourselves, to be in relationship with those who suffer. So, in a way, compassion repositions us because with compassion, instead of turning away from those who suffer and are afflicted, people who are transformed by the virtue of compassion turn toward them and do what they can, like Jesus, to make themselves available to the struggles and afflictions of others. With compassion, we allow the tears and sorrows of others to enter our hearts, to touch us, and to change us. With compassion, like Jesus, something happens to us when we encounter people who suffer. Now, when Thomas Aquinas was writing about compassion, he spoke of compassion as mercy. The Latin word that he used was misericordia, which means a deep sorrow of heart. Misericordia. So our hearts are moved. We experience sorrow because of the afflictions and sufferings of others. Misericordia, this deep sorrow of heart, is what compassionate people feel over another's misfortune. With compassion, something of the pain and distress of another becomes our own. With compassion, something of the pain and sorrow of another becomes our own. And that's what compassion literally means. Compassion means to suffer together. So we don't close off ourselves to others. We don't close and harden our hearts. Rather, with compassion, we move toward people who are suffering. Compassion is the opposite of apathy. With apathy, we close our hearts and we choose to feel nothing. With apathy, we close our hearts and we're moved by nothing. And thus, we never come out of ourselves to help people in pain. Like Jesus in the Gospels, compassion begins deep inside of us when we allow our hearts to be stirred by another's misfortune. With compassion, we really are pained and distressed by another person's pain and distress. They become part of us. Now, why is that? Why is it with compassion that we really are pained and distressed by another's pain and distress? Why is it that the person who is suffering becomes part of us? I think it's because compassion reminds us of the bond that connects us to every human being and really to all creatures. We feel with them in their sufferings because we really are always and already connected to them. They are part of us and we are part of them. Compassion flows from the truth of who we are. We are not utterly separate, disconnected beings. Rather, we are linked, bonded, and connected to everyone else, and really to everything else, which is why their suffering touches us, enters into us, and becomes part of us. With compassion, we see another human being, not as a stranger whom we can safely ignore or casually dismiss. Rather, compassion teaches us to see a suffering human being as someone like us, a vulnerable person who depends on the love and goodness of others. I think that's so important. Compassion reminds us of our shared vulnerability. No matter who we are, each one of us depends on the love, kindness, and goodness of others. So, with compassion, we see another person as inseparable from us, even if we know nothing else about them. Compassion requires no prior knowledge of the person who's suffering. What we need to know is what we always know, that they, like us, are a vulnerable human being in need. Now, yesterday we used the metaphor of journey to talk about one reason we need the virtues. What compassion reminds us is that as we take that journey, as we move through life, we meet people who are suffering, people who are broken, shattered, wounded, and in tears. These people are put on the path alongside us. Compassion teaches us that to become good at being human, rather than turning away from those who are suffering, we, like the Good Samaritan, allow our lives to be interrupted, disrupted, and even redirected by them. With compassion, rather than ignoring them, we befriend them. With compassion, we allow ourselves to be bothered. Now, I think that's such an important moral quality. What we don't want to ever become is people who remain unbothered by the needs, afflictions, and struggles of others. People of compassion allow themselves to be bothered. That's why I think this virtue is so crucial for any member of the Passionist family. So much so that it's hard to imagine a passionist without compassion. The world needs passionists because the world needs people. It needs communities who are willing to have their lives interrupted, disrupted, and redirected by the sorrows and tribulations of others. The world needs people and communities who are willing to befriend those who are in need. It needs people and communities who refuse to remain unbothered by the afflictions of others. This is why the passionists will always matter. It's why the passionists will always be needed. There will never become a point where the world does not need people who choose to be bothered by the sufferings of others. And I think that gets to the heart of a passionist. A passionist is the woman or man who lets himself be bothered, be touched by the suffering of others. I think that's especially important today because in many respects, I think today we have not a culture of mercy and compassion, but rather a culture of tough luck. If you're suffering and in need, it's simply tough luck. We have a culture that's become, in many ways, the survival of the fittest, the strongest, the wealthiest, the luckiest, a culture in which everyone must look after themselves because no one else will. Today, so many people do what they can, to be sure that the needs of others never interrupt, disrupt, or prevent their own plans. I can't help but to think of some of the policies that have been unfolding in our government the past several months. When we think about cuts to aid to people in need, cuts to program to that help people who are struggling. In many sense, I think the logic behind all of those policies is don't bother me. If a country gets to the point where it's unwilling to reach out and help people on the margins who are suffering, essentially they're saying, tough luck, you're on your own, don't bother us. The world cannot allow that to happen. It can't afford those kinds of people, those kinds of attitudes. So, to be good at being human, we must become the kind of people who intentionally allow themselves to be bothered by the struggles and sufferings of others. Why? Because take compassion away and cruelty appears. You can count on it. If you take compassion away, cruelty will appear. And I think we see that. Once compassion is no longer in the picture, we see policies, language, ways of speaking that are cruel and dehumanizing. They're not compassionate. Take compassion away, and cruelty and meanness come to the fore. So to be good at to be good at being human, not only do we need to become compassionate, but I think compassion also requires us to abandon the idea that our time is our own. In so many ways today, I think we're encouraged to see time as just another commodity. So time is a kind of precious possession, like money, that we have to manage and control, lest somebody steal it away from us. And that pops up in the way we talk. My time is my own. I don't want to waste time. I want to spend my time carefully. Compassion can't work with that kind of understanding of time. Compassion requires that we see time not just as another commodity, but rather that we realize that time is God's gift to us. It's not my possession. Time is God's gift to us to do good for others. It's a different way of thinking about time. Instead of seeing time as a scarce resource, compassion invites us to see time as a gift that's entrusted to us to do good for others. Compassionate people know that. They know that their time is not their own, but rather their time is God's gift by which they're enabled to do good. How do we do that? How does that work with compassion? With compassion, we do good for others by taking our own experience with suffering, our own familiarity with suffering, our own history with suffering, and using it to help others who are suffering. Compassion reminds us that because we too have suffered, we have something to offer people who are suffering. That, I think, is deeply integral to the Passionist charism. Passionists know that none of us wants to suffer. We don't go looking for suffering, but eventually all of us do suffer. Suffering is an unwanted part of our lives, but it's also an inescapable part of our lives. With compassion, instead of allowing suffering to harden us or embitter us, or instead of allowing suffering to close us in on ourselves, we use it to bless and to benefit others. With compassion, we turn a burden into a gift. With compassion, we take our own experience of suffering, the way suffering can burden us and being an unwanted intrusion into our lives, and instead of allowing it to become something toxic that embitters us, we turn it into a gift. Now, I want to just give an example of this that hits home for me. About a year and a half ago, one of my nephews, Will Augustus, died at 40 years old because of alcoholism. It was a really tragic death, a very difficult time for my sister Ann and her husband Neil, Will's parents, for his sister Molly and his brothers Paul and Andrew, but really for our whole family. And as you can imagine, Will's death threw my sister Ann and her husband Neil into a deep period of grief and desolation. They had to find their way out of it. And as my sister told me, when something like this happens, when you experience that kind of grief, your life will never be the same. You just have to find a way to integrate that grief so that you're able to go on. What she's done recently, she joined a group called Stephen's Ministry that began in St. Louis and I guess is spreading over the country. And what Stephen ministers do, they go visit people in their homes who are struggling. It could be from grief, it could be from loss, it could be from loneliness, it could be from all kinds of reasons. But Stephen ministers reach out in compassion to people who are suffering along the way. Now, I think what Anne did is a beautiful example of compassion. You take an experience of unwanted suffering, such as the death of your son, and you turn a burden into a gift. That, I think, is what Passionists know so well. If suffering is not to get the best of us, there must be a way for us, as the theologian Patricia McAuliffe writes, to make suffering productive of good. So how do we take something that's primarily negative, an experience that we would never choose, how do we make it productive of good? That's the special power of compassion. With compassion, we make suffering productive of good by using our own experience of suffering to identify with others who are suffering. With compassion, like Jesus, we don't stand at a safe distance, but rather we reach out, we stand with, and we do what we can to help a fellow sufferer. There's a Jesuit theologian named James Keenan who's written a lot about compassion. And Keenan typically speaks of compassion in terms of mercy. And he describes mercy or compassion as the willingness to enter into the chaos of others so as to answer them in their need. The willingness to enter into the chaos of others so to answer them in their need. So it's a perfect example that with compassion, we don't stand at a safe distance. We get up close, we get involved, we get immersed in the chaos and messiness of the life of another in order to be with them. We become a fellow sufferer with them, which is exactly, again, the meaning of compassion. It's suffering together, suffering with. But Keenan says, if you ask why should we be compassionate and merciful, Keenan says it is because God was, is, and always will be compassionate and merciful to us. In becoming one of us in Jesus, God entered fully into the chaos, the messiness, the sorrows, and the sufferings of our world to stand with us in our need. No, nowhere is that clearer than in the crucified Christ. To contemplate the crucified Christ is to know that we have a God who never holds back. We have a God who will never remain unbothered by the sufferings and afflictions of others. The crucified Christ tells us that we worship a God who is not afraid, who is not ashamed to be immersed into the chaos, the messiness, the muck, the disorder, all the sorrows and tears of life. Why? Because we have a God who will never hold back. That's compassion. So we are called to do what Jesus says at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells the Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. That's the summons of compassion. Not to hold back, but to go and do likewise. Now, there's one more thing about compassion that I think is worth mentioning. When Aquinas was treating mercy and compassion, writing about it, he says something that I think is profoundly interesting and insightful. Aquinas said that God shows forth his almighty power principally through compassion. God shows forth his almighty power principally through compassion. Now that got my attention because Aquinas is saying God's power is God's compassion and mercy. It's not how we usually think about power. Typically, we think about power in terms of military might, our money, or being able to get our way, or to have influence, or to dominate, or to control. But Aquinas is saying no. Power for God is completely different. Power for God is primarily shown through compassion and mercy. In fact, Aquinas says it is then that God is most powerful. I think he's saying that we should think of power in terms of the good that we can do, not in terms of prevailing, not in terms of getting our way. But don't the Gospels invite us, especially through compassion, to think about power differently? To say that power is not prevailing, but power is the capacity to do good, which is exactly what happens through acts of mercy and compassion. And Aquinas even goes further. He says that compassion and mercy are the virtues that make us most like God. So if you want to become like God, Aquinas is saying, be compassionate, be merciful. Compassion and mercy are the actions by which we most resemble God. Now, in 2016, Pope Francis declared a year of mercy. And in declaring that year of mercy, he wrote, "A little bit of mercy can change the world." I love that insight because sometimes we can think of mercy and compassion as maybe trifling, as helpful, but not all that powerful. But in a way, Pope Francis was agreeing with Aquinas. He was saying even a little bit of mercy, even a small act of compassion, can change the world. This is what Passionists know. Every member of the Passionist family knows that a little bit of compassion, a little bit of mercy goes a long way. Those are powerful, indelible, memorable acts. So that's what we're called to do. What the world needs now are people, individuals, and communities who are willing to answer the call to be agents of God's mercy and compassion in our world today. They need people who are willing to see themselves as agents, as minister of God's mercy and compassion, whenever it's needed, to whomever it's needed, in whatever way that we might be called to offer it. So in order to become good at being human, we need people who say, yes, I'm going to allow myself to be bothered by the needs of others. So this brings us to kindness. A second virtue we should never be without, but again, one I think that is desperately needed today, is kindness. To explain why kindness is so important to becoming good at being human, I want to turn to a scene in Wendell Berry's wonderful novel, Hannah Coulter. If you know Wendell Berry, he's a Kentucky farmer who's also just a beautiful essayist and a great novelist. Well, one of his novels that I like the most is Hannah Coulter. The novel begins with Nathan, Nathan's father, and Nathan's 80-year-old grandfather, along with a few others, working together on a farm. When Nathan's grandfather starts to feel ill, his father tells Nathan, walk home with him, help him along, take care of him. Now, those words, walk home with him, help him along, take care of him, drive the story of Hannah Coulter. And I think they ought to drive the story of our lives. Walk home with one another, help one another, take care of one another. It's very simple, straightforward advice, and yet it's what we are created to do. We're not given life to make sure everything always turns out best for us. Rather, aren't we given life to watch out for one another, to be mindful of one another, to help one another along? That's kindness. Kindness is a matter of watching out for one another, helping one another along the way in any way that we can. Now, kindness begins in a certain way of seeing. Kindness requires a specific moral vision. Kindness teaches us that we ought to see one another not as nuisances who keep getting in our way and messing up our life, but kindness teaches us to see one another as gifts, gifts who have been entrusted to one another. Kindness forms us into people whose attitudes, thoughts, words, and actions communicate a fundamental truth of our lives, namely, that we are given one another to do good by one another. To become good at being human, I think we have to live out of that truth, that we are given one another to do good by one another. We are given one another to help each other along. So kindness obliges us. It not only calls us, but I think kindness really is a serious moral obligation because it obliges us to see others as gifts, whether they are members of our family, people we live with in community, people we work with, or strangers we may never see again. But we know seeing one another as gifts isn't always easy. In fact, after a while, it's much easier to see one another, especially those who are closest to us, not as gifts, but as threats. Why? Because our way of seeing becomes pinched and selective, and maybe a little cloudy and distorted. Or we simply start taking one another for granted, assuming that what we know of a person is all that there is to know about them, or convincing ourselves that there's not a reason to know them because they'll never change. Or maybe we just get tired of one another, or perhaps even bored with the very people that before we could not imagine ourselves without. I think this is a common experience. Our vision becomes pinched. And so it's the little things about other people and little things about us that can irritate us, that can drive us crazy. So that instead of seeing one another as gifts, we can little by little begin to see other people as gifts, as threats. But once that happens, we start seeing one another in less than charitable ways. As a result, we no longer walk with them or help them along or care for them. We simply let them be. That should always be a warning. When kindness goes missing, it's a sure sign that we are no longer seeing as we need to see. As I mentioned on Monday, the way we see matters because we always act according to how we see. Our actions flow from our vision. Our actions are shaped by our vision. And that means I cannot possibly act rightly unless I first learn to see rightly. What I need to see is the sacred mystery that lives at the heart of every person, even those who sometimes bother me or drive me crazy. What I need to see is exactly what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, that we are all members of one body, a body in which no part is any more important than any other part. That's the vision of kindness. We are all members of one body, and no member of that body is any more important than any other part. It's a memorable example of this for me. I've been mentioning Stanley Hauerwas this week. Hauerwas was my mentor when I was in graduate school at Notre Dame. In one of his earlier books, He tells the story of worshiping at a Methodist church in South Bend when he was on the faculty at Notre Dame. Well, there was an elderly woman who was a member of that church who had a son with a physical disability. They were active members of that small Methodist church. They were at church every Sunday. And Harawas said because that little faith community wanted to take what Paul says seriously, that no member of the body is any more important than any other member, because they wanted to be the kind of community that says every member of this body matters. When it would come time for the communion service, they would always allow this woman and her son to be first in line, even though that would slow down the process of distributing communion. They wanted them to be first as a way of saying, even the people that others may see as lesser members of the body, they matter. Now, there was one Sunday, Harawas says, where this mother and her son did not show up for church. And he said the community that morning had a really serious discussion about whether they should have communion that day, because they were asking themselves, can we really celebrate communion when two members of the body are not with us? Now, to me, I think that's a beautiful expression of kindness. It's coming to realize that every member of the body is so important. Can we really think of communion? Can we celebrate communion without them? That's the vision of kindness. Now, a few years ago, there was an article in the Christian Century by a woman named Amy Peterson that really expanded my understanding of kindness. Peterson wrote that we are much more likely to be kind to whomever or whatever we see as our kin. In fact, she stressed, to be kind meant to be kin. Kindness flows from kinship. Kindness flows from the abiding awareness that we are bound and connected to one another, as well as bound and connected to the whole of creation. Kindness and kinship are mutually connected because kindness is the direct result of a moral and spiritual vision that recognizes we really are all one. We really are all sisters and brothers to one another, and therefore should be kind to one another. Kindness requires kinship. But of course, so often what we see around us is not a vision of kinship, but rather a vision where kinship is either seriously weakened or denied. The more I refuse to see any person, any group, or any community as kin, the easier it is to treat them unkindly, whether that unkindness is expressed through indifference, neglect, exclusion, diminishment, cruelty, or maliciousness. As Peterson wrote in that essay, the fact that indigenous people lost their land and often their lives, and the fact that Black men, women, and children were enslaved witnesses the catastrophic injustice that happens when we refuse to see any people as kin. To put it another way, unkindness has many expressions, but no matter what form unkindness takes, it always diminishes, sometimes gradually, chipping away at another person's dignity and sense of their self, bit by bit over time, but sometimes suddenly. As extreme forms of injustice illustrate, unkindness, the refusal to see another as kin, can even be deadly. So this is why kindness, I think, is such an important virtue that we should never be without. As I mentioned yesterday, a virtue is something we do. It's a way of being and acting in the world. Kindness characterizes people who regularly look for ways to do good for others. A person of kindness regularly takes a befriending stance towards others and does what he or she can to help them. A person of real kindness has genuine goodwill toward everyone. and if the opportunity arises, expresses that goodwill through visible acts of kindness. In his analysis of kindness, Aquinas wrote, even though a person is not actually doing good to someone, charity requires them to be prepared to do so if the occasion arises, and whoever the person in need might be. That's a really demanding understanding of kindness. Aquinas says even though a person may not actually be doing good to someone, charity requires them to be prepared to do so if the occasion arises, and whoever the person in need might be. Aquinas believed that kindness should be the fundamental stance that we have towards others, that kindness should be our fundamental orientation in life. He envisioned a community permeated with kindness, a community in which each person is poised and ready, actively on the lookout to show kindness, knowing the occasion will always present itself. I was thinking about this morning. It's hard to imagine a day where we wouldn't have any opportunity to be kind. Even you can say, well, what if you spent a day all by yourself? You could still write somebody a letter. You could still make a phone call. You could still reach out with some kind of kindness. And notice that Aquinas put no restrictions, no limits on kindness. In saying that we should be prepared to be kind to whoever the person in need might be, Aquinas says that's everybody, because all of us, in some ways, will always be people in need of kindness. This is why we should never be stingy with kindness, but rather creative with kindness, extravagant with kindness, each day eager to do what we can to draw others out of themselves with kindness. And kindness admits of no exceptions, because no one should ever be excluded from the community that kindness creates. So kindness is a force for community. Kindness draws people together. Kindness creates community. And what Aquinas is saying is that nobody should ever be outside or on the margins or excluded from the community created by kindness. So it's easy sometimes, I think, to overlook the importance of kindness because kindness isn't easy. Kindness calls us to be attuned with one another, to be attentive with one another. Kindness means that we show respect and regard for every person who crosses our path. Or as Nathan says in Hannah Coulter, kindness means that we should never be too busy to help one another along, to care for one another. It's easy to overlook the importance of kindness, but when that happens, we slowly begin to withdraw from one another, to take one another for granted. When kindness goes missing, we become unmindful of one another. Now, kindness matters because no matter how small, any act of kindness is always more powerful than anything that threatens to pull the body apart. And I really believe that any act of kindness, no matter how small, is always more powerful than anything that threatens to pull the body apart. Now, today we know we're surrounded with so many forces, so many dynamics, so many movements that don't pull the body together, that blow it apart, that fragment it, that cause the body to break into pieces, to disintegrate. Kindness pushes back against those disintegrating forces because kindness is a unifying force, an integrating force. Kindness is humanizing because it keeps us connected to one another, attuned to one another, and alert to one another. When we practice kindness, when we take that virtue to heart, we make an important discovery. We discover that we live to bless and to be blessed. We discover that we love to be blessed, and I think we love to bless. There's not a single day that I don't need a blessing. And I suspect that's true for all of us. There's not a single day that we don't need to be blessed. And that's what happens through kindness. If you've ever received an unexpected blessing in a moment when you desperately needed to be blessed, you know how powerful a blessing can be. You realize how life-saving a blessing can be. I have an example of that, which might seem silly, but if you were ever been a dog owner, you'll probably can sympathize with this. For about 13 or 14 years, my wife and I had an Australian cattle dog named Peanut. And Peanut became a really important part of our lives, much more than I ever expected. Well, unfortunately, back in January of 2020, we had to put Peanut down because she had lymphoma, and there was no way that she was going to be cured from that, and she was suffering quite a bit. Well, Peanut's death affected my wife, Carmela, and me far more than we ever anticipated. I mean, I really felt desolate over the death of this dog. Well, a few days after she died, I was on a plane heading to Waco, Texas, and I was reading a little book written by a man. It was who himself had lost a number of pets, and the book was about how to get over the death of a pet. Well, there was a woman sitting next to me, and at one point she looked at me and she said, "Well, what are you reading?" And I explained to her about the book, and I told her, "Well, so we just lost our dog." Well, she began to talk to me about two dogs that she and her daughter had, and how much she cared for these dogs, and how hard she knew it would be whenever those dogs died. And that little act of kindness, that little unexpected blessing, saved me. In a way, I was so touched by that. I mean, she didn't have to say that. She didn't have to do that. But that's the power of kindness. You know, we never know when a person might be in need. We never know how an act of kindness might rescue them, might help them. So there's so many ways that we can bless other people with kindness. We bless one another when we take time to ask how somebody is doing and listen to what they have to say in response. We bless one another when we take a moment to thank somebody for who they are and what they do, and let them know that they are appreciated. We bless one another when we let someone know through our words and our actions that it's good that they're here, and the body would not be the same without them. And we bless one another when we have insight into what might be good for them, and we act on that insight. Everything I've said today tells us that if we risk practicing kindness, we will be deeply transformed, and the world will be better for us. That's the power of kindness. If you risk practicing kindness, you will be transformed. You will become a better person, a different person, and the world will be better because of you. That's because people who are nurtured by the virtue of kindness, they inhabit the world differently. People of kindness approach each day not by asking, "What's in it for me?" but "How can I do good here?" People of kindness approach each day asking not, "What can I get out of you?" but how might I be needed? Maybe more than anything, people who have become true experts of kindness know that at every moment of our lives, we have a choice. At every moment of our lives, we have the choice to love the person in front of us. People of kindness take the choice to love the person in front of them because they know that's the choice that matters most. That's the choice that should never be set aside or forgotten. They know that every day we have the choice to love the person right in front of us. So there's nothing mysterious about kindness. It just comes down to whether we're willing to love the person in front of us. Doing that makes us very good at being human. So this brings us to the virtue of hope. So how should Christians think about hope? Where should we begin? But to get to the heart of a Christian understanding of hope, I think it's good to begin with Romans 5:5. There, Paul writes, hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. That's the starting point for how Christians should rightly think about hope. Hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Paul is reminding us that hope is not primarily something we give ourselves. We don't acquire hope through grit and determination. Rather, Paul is telling us that hope is first and foremost a gift. Hope is the gift of God's life, goodness, and love that was poured into our hearts from the moment we came into being. Hope is the gift that is always the foundation and center of our lives. God's life, God's love, and God's goodness is the gift we never lose, the gift that sustains us and never forsakes us, the gift from which we continually live. This is why for Christians, to be is to be hopeful. For Christians, to be is to be hopeful. The heart of hope is recognizing that every day we live from a gift that we could never have given ourselves, but also a gift that we'll never lose, a gift that can never be taken away from us. This tells us something we should never forget. Our lives are inherently hopeful. We can even say that our lives are inescapably hopeful because they are anchored in a grace that no adversity, no hardship, and no challenge can ever overcome. As Paul proclaimed in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's the logic of hope. If God is for us, who can possibly be against us? Thanks to God's grace that has been poured out into every one of us, we cannot escape the power of hope, even if we tried, because hope is inscribed into our very being. Hope lives at the heart of who we are. Hope is our spiritual DNA. This is why fanning flames of hope ought to be something that we readily and regularly do. It's why fanning flames of hope should never be too much to ask of us. That's because Christians know, even if we easily forget, that grace is not something lifeless and inert, that God's grace is not something flabby and flimsy. Rather, Christians believe, even if we never hear this often enough, that grace is the power of God for life, even when all seems dead. Now, Jane Patterson said that at a talk she gave at Baylor University on October 25th, 2023, and it's the best description of grace I've ever heard. Grace is the power of God for life, even when all seems dead. As Patterson insisted, grace is a power. Grace is a dynamic and creative and surprising energy, and it is always the energy of God for life, always the power and energy that we believe nothing can defeat or overcome, even when all seems dead. This power of God for life pulsates through a Christian understanding of hope, and it is what makes Christian hope so resilient, so creative, so audacious, and truly incomparable. The Passionists know this. Anyone who keeps the memory of the Passion alive in their hearts knows that the power of God is for life, even when all seems dead. Passionists know that amid the pain, the suffering, and the brokenness, God is always sowing seeds of hope. They know that amid the pain, the sorrow, and the brokenness, God is always creating something new. In their life and in their ministry, the Passionist family knows that God is always sowing seeds of hope, and they refuse to let those seeds of hope wither and die. They spread those seeds of hope and they keep them alive. God is always sowing seeds of hope. As passionists, we refuse to allow those seeds of hope to wither and die. We spread them around. Now, this is why passionist communities, passionist parishes, and passionist retreat centers should never be places where hope is timid or tame, much less places where hope goes into hiding. It's why the passionist family should never be tame or timid in hope, much less a family where hope goes missing. Anywhere there are passionists, flames of hope should be bursting out all the time, illuminating and empowering who the passionists are and all that they do. And if anyone asks a passionist why hope animates who they are and all that they do, they should say, "We trust in the one who raises the dead." That's the power of hope. Why do we refuse to become people who are hopeless? Because we trust in the one who raises the dead. So how practically does hope work in our lives? Aquinas here can help us understand how hope emerges and unfolds for us. He identifies three components of hope. First, Aquinas says hope concerns something good that we desire, but do not yet possess, which makes sense. If we have what we wanted, there would be no reason to hope for it. Hope always concerns a future good, which is why there is a not yet quality to hope, and why hope always leads to action. Hope stretches us because hope turns us towards something good and inspires us to pursue it. We can begin to see why hope is such an essential virtue for life. If we didn't hope for anything, we would never begin to act. It is through hope that we engage life, through hope that we set goals and purposes for our lives and strive to achieve them. Hope gets us out of bed in the morning, and despair convinces us to stay there. Without hope, our lives shut down. Second, Aquinas claimed that the something good to which hope aspires is difficult but possible to attain. So the something good that we hope for is difficult but possible to attain. And that makes sense too. There is no need for hope if I can easily attain what I want. It would make no sense for me to tell my wife, Carmela, that what I really hope for this evening is a dish of ice cream, because there would be no difficulty at all in attaining that. I would only need to get up and walk a few steps to the refrigerator. So hope isn't necessary when what we want is easily within our grasp. But neither is there any reason to hope if we know from the start that what we want, no matter how good it might be, cannot possibly be attained. If there's clearly no hope in achieving what we desire, why even try? For me, a hopeless good would be ever trying to teach math. Math was not my strong suit. So even though teaching math can be a really good thing, for Paul Wadell, it's simply not possible. I can hope for that all that I want. It's never going to happen. So hope has to reach to something that's good. It's difficult, but it's possible. So this is why the third element of hope is so crucial. Aquinas said that hope strains toward a difficult good that can be attained either through our own efforts or with the help of others. Now that's so important because Aquinas is reassuring us that we do not have to limit the scope of our hope only to those things that we can secure by ourselves. So being able to turn to others, to rely on others, significantly broadens hope's possibilities. If what I hope for extends no further than what I might be able to achieve by myself, then my hope will be fairly limited. But if we can rely on others to help us accomplish what we cannot do on our own, the horizons of hope become much more expansive, much more imaginative, much more promising. Aquinas is simply saying the more people we can turn to who can help us achieve what we hope for, the greater the object of our hope can be, and the greater our confidence in reaching it. Or to say it another way, the more people who share our hope, the better things are. The more we can become communities of hope, seeking after the same goods, the better things are. It's exactly why Aquinas said we are much more inclined to be hopeful when we have friends to rely on. We're much more inclined to be hopeful when we have friends to rely on. And I think what Aquinas is reminding us of is that we never hope alone. We always hope together. You and I need companions in hope, partners of hope. We need people who stand by us and refuse to abandon us when life is hard. But we also need people who help us achieve the important goals and purposes of our lives. Hope requires friendships and healthy communities. It might be an interesting thing to ask yourself or just to think about who have been companions in hope for you. Who's been there, like Wendell Berry said, to accompany you, to help you along, to care for you? Who has been for you a companion or partner in hope? Well, St. Paul of the Cross certainly understood this because one of the first things he did was to call companions to join him in proclaiming God's love for us in the crucified Jesus. Passionists today know that we can hope for so much more when we have others to rely on. They know that we can expand our hopes. We can imagine much more when there are others who share our hope. That's exactly what happened when we began to speak of the Passionist family, lay and religious, who share the same hope. I think that's what the Passionist family is. The Passionist family is simply all the people who share the same hope, of proclaiming God's love for us in the crucified Jesus. But Aquinas speaks of help from others. When he does this, he's not just talking about people in our own lives that we can rely on. He's also talking about God. Aquinas said, God is like any friend because God loves us and wants our good. Like any friend, God desires our happiness and seeks what is best for us. But the good that God wants for us is the richest and most fulfilling good of all, namely everlasting life with God and the saints. That's why our hope should never be puny or timid or tame. That's why our hope should never be safe or conventional. Christian hope trains our sights on what really matters. Christian hope calls us to look up so that we don't settle for anything less than what God wants to offer us. There's a boldness to Christian hope because Christianity teaches us that the undeniably best thing that we can ever hope for is exactly what God wants to give us. This is why Aquinas insisted that we don't really understand hope until, as he says, we hope for nothing less from God than God's very self. That's the vision of hope. We don't really understand hope until we hope for nothing less from God than God's very self. To say it another way, I think more often the problem is not that we hope for too much, but that we settle for too little. The problem is not that our hopes aim too high, but that we lower our sights. We sell ourselves short. We reduce the scope of our hope. But hope is not only God's gift to us, it's also a virtue. It's a way of being and acting. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI wrote a beautiful letter on hope entitled Spe Salvi, which is Latin for saved in hope. Near the beginning of the letter, Pope Benedict said, "The one who has hope lives differently. The one who hopes has been granted the gift of new life." It's It's a beautiful insight. The one who has hope lives differently. The one who hopes has been granted the gift of a new life. So Pope Benedict is saying is that hope is a gift that should lead to better ways of being and acting. That hope is a gift that we need to keep alive, to deepen and nurture. And we do that through hopeful acts. So like compassion and kindness, hope is something we do. Because we have been blessed with hope, we are called to bless others with hope. And we do so, Benedict says, through ordinary acts of love, mercy, kindness, and compassion. In Saved by Hope, Pope Benedict captured this when he said, all serious and upright human conduct is hope in action. All serious and upright human conduct is hope in action. I love that phrase, hope in action, not only because it tells us that genuine hope always leads to hopeful ways of being and acting, but also because it says we keep hope alive when we bless others with hope, when we commit ourselves to doing good in all the beautiful ways good can be done. Near the end of Spe Salvi, Benedict wrote, the true stars of our life are the people who have lived good lives. They are lights of hope. The true stars of our life are the people who have lived good lives. They are lights of hope. And I'm sure each of us who can think of so many people who were stars of hope for us, lights of hope in our lives. This week, we've been reflecting on how to become good at being human. Those people showed us that one sure way to become good at being human is that when we are lights, our hope, lights of hope for others. That's a calling for every human being, but it certainly is a calling for all of us who are members of the Passionist family. In our life together as a Passionist family and through our ministries, Passionists should shine brightly as stars of hope. It's a beautiful way to become good at being human. So thank you again for listening this morning. I appreciate that.